And that's going to require some restrictions on God's part. God created us in His image, and as our affirmation of who is doing the creating, in Scripture we're saying God is doing the creating, that God has knit us together in our mother's womb. This Genesis 1 talks about that stewardship a little bit more. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Another way to look at that dominion is not lording over, but let them have stewardship, let them control with the power that God gives us, but we're entrusted with the responsibility of all these things as well. In order to honor this relationship that God is giving us power, and God is giving us a voice, and God is giving us responsibilities, God needs to restrain His use of power. We see in the flood story, God looks around the earth and He sees all the evil that is going on. And He is deeply grieved by this evil. And so He destroys the earth. He floods the earth and starts over. And then God is sad that He has done that, and promises that He will never do it again. So the rainbow is a sign of God's restraint in the use of His power. That He is never again going to destroy the earth because of the evil that is present. So come what may, God is going to hold back. God is going to take a different tact for engaging evil and suffering in the world. God is not simply going to get frustrated with your sin, my sin, the evil that's present in the world, and just destroy us. God's going to find a different way to engage it. That means that God is going to continue to be grieved by the suffering and the sin that is present in creation. That God suffers, that God grieves with us. A little bit of a foreign concept. Can God grieve? Can God suffer? I mean, that's one of the challenges of Jesus Christ. To say that Jesus is a God, but also would be suffer and see die. Can those things be held in place? And what is revealed in Jesus is yes, God can suffer. God can die and be raised again, just as He'll do for us.
So can He make mistakes? You just said that He made a mistake by causing the flood.
I said He was grieved and sorry. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting, I don't know. What do you think?
Depends on how literally we want to take the flood story.
Right. Yeah. No, that's certainly there are theologians who will argue that that's entirely possible. I'm not quite ready to say that God makes mistakes, but I think God allows for freedom in this world to such an extent that God needs to respond to the messes that are made in ways that God doesn't necessarily want to respond.
If Jesus is part of a triune God and He lived for 30 years as a man on earth, He must have made a mistake, which nobody did anything about.
And exactly opposite is proclaimed by Scripture, that he was sinless. And so...
Mistakes don't have to be a sin.
True. Good questions. Yeah, we see in Scripture that several times God has to do things that are challenging for us to understand in order to clean up or correct the mess that he is experiencing. When the story, as Jeremiah and Isaiah tell it, of the Babylonians coming to conquer Jerusalem, is a response to the people's persistent worship of other gods. God says, "You shall have no other gods before me," sends prophet after prophet to the people of Israel saying, "Hey, turn back to God, and they refuse. Instead, they worship other cultural deities. And so God uses the Babylonian army as a corrective tool, which ultimately is an instrument of death. And there's references to the Scripture that talk about how God is grieved by that action as well. Yet, the God of Scripture doesn't strike people with lightning bolts. He's not Zeus. God is working in this world and through the creatures of this world to accomplish his work. Going on, not only is God grieved by the suffering of creation, God is going to find a different way to engage evil in this world, and we see that God is going to do that through Jesus Christ. In Jesus, God takes on suffering, God takes on evil, and says this is not the end of the story. Suffering, sin, death are put to death on the cross, and there is a resurrection, which leads to the promise of Revelation that God will be with us, that he'll wipe every tear from our eyes, death will be no more, mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. See, the one seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." And that's the final promise that God gives to us, that he is and will make all things new. It's something that is happening in part now, but that will happen fully in the time to come. So, why suffering? Some suffering is a part of the struggle that belongs to the created order. Loneliness, limits, temptation, and anxiety are all things that we see in Genesis chapter 2, before the fall. That Adam is lonely. God has created Adam and he hasn't found the right partner. He's lonely. We experience loneliness. It's part of our suffering. That there are limits to our intelligence, our agility, our strength, many other limits that we face. That's part of who we are as creation. Temptation is part of the created order. What we see in Genesis is the snake comes with temptation. You have to remember, this is not the devil. The devil doesn't come for many, many years later as a theological concept. This is a snake. This is part of creation that is coming and offering a different word. This is something that God has created. So temptation is part of the created order. And finally, anxiety. Anxiety, not to the point of depression, but anxiety as that which drove Eve to grab the fruit, that drove Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit. Anxiety about our future and our place in this world. That's part of who Adam and Eve are prior to the fall, according to Scripture. And that's part of the created order. All right. Okay. Also, why I'm suffering, God has created a dynamic world. All these things, earthquakes, volcanoes, glaciers, storms, viruses, bacteria, they're active in this world. Sometimes we get in the way.